Beijing, China, October 6, 1976, 9 p.m. Wang Hongwen walks through the corridors of Zhongnanhai, the walled compound adjacent to the Forbidden City, where China's most powerful leaders live and work, toward Reading Room 119. He has been told the meeting is about the publication of Mao Zedong's collected works. He is walking confidently, the way a man walks when he has spent the last decade at the center of a revolution that he helped lead, when he has spent years as the third most powerful person in the most populous country on earth, when he has lived inside a universe organized entirely around his position and has had no reliable information suggesting that universe is about to end. He does not know that in the next 2 hours he and the 3 other members of the Gang of Four will be arrested, removed from every position they hold, and effectively erased from Chinese political life. He does not know that the guards who will meet him in Reading Room 119 are not there for a meeting about Mao's published works. He does not know that the 41 years of his life up to this moment, the factory work in Shanghai, the revolutionary organizing, the meteoric ascent through the Cultural Revolution's convulsions to the third highest position in the Chinese Communist Party are about to be reduced to a file in an archive and an accusation in a courtroom. He is about to cross the threshold of his own destruction. Across Zhongnanhai, in 3 separate locations, the other 3 members of the Gang of Four are being summoned by different pretexts to different rooms where similar receptions await. Jiang Qing, the ideological architect of the radical left, is being called to what he believes is the same meeting. Yao Wenyuan, the propagandist who controlled every word published in China, is being detained at the Central Broadcasting Office. Jiang Qing, Mao's widow and the most feared woman in China, is being confronted in her residence in Zhongnanhai. In less than 2 hours, the 4 people who had controlled China's cultural, ideological and political life for the better part of a decade will be in custody. The operation has been planned with military precision by men who understand, with the specific clarity of people who have lived through the Cultural Revolution's terror, that any hesitation or any failure of coordination will mean that the side that intended to arrest will become the side that is arrested. 27 days have passed since Mao Zedong died on September 9, 1976. 27 days since the death of the man whose authority had protected these 4 people, whose revolutionary mythology had been the source of their power, whose name they had been invoking for a decade to destroy their enemies and advance their ambitions. 27 days was all it took. This is the story of those 27 days, of the hidden machinery that moved in the shadows of the most traumatic succession crisis in the history of the People's Republic, of the men who organized the most consequential arrest in modern Chinese history, of the specific mechanisms by which a group of 4 people who had dominated China's political life for years were destroyed in a single night, and of what their destruction revealed about the nature of power in a system built entirely around one man's authority, because the destruction of the Gang of Four was not simply the end of 4 political careers. It was the end of an era, the brutal closure of the Cultural Revolution that had convulsed China for a decade, the death of the permanent revolution that Mao had tried to institutionalize, and the birth of the pragmatic, economically oriented China that would transform the world in the decades that followed. All of it happened in 27 days. To understand what happened in those 27 days, you need to understand who the Gang of Four actually were, because the official history that China subsequently constructed around them is one of the most elaborate pieces of political mythology in the history of communist states, and the mythology has consistently obscured the more interesting and more instructive truth. The Gang of Four was not a gang in any ordinary sense. It was not a secret organization with a formal structure, a set of bylaws, and an explicit membership. It was a political faction, an alliance of 4 individuals who shared interests, shared ideological commitments, and shared vulnerability within the post-Mao succession created the specific convergence of purpose that made them function as a collective, even without the formal structures that collective action typically requires. Jiang Qing was the first among them, in terms of political significance, if not in terms of formal party rank. Born Li Shumeng in 1914 in Shandong province, she had been an actress in Shanghai before the revolution, a background that the party establishment considered deeply unsuitable for the wife of the chairman. Her marriage to Mao in the late 1930s had been permitted only under specific conditions negotiated by the party leadership. She was to have no political role for 20 years, confining herself to domestic and personal functions, and leaving the party's political direction to those with the appropriate credentials. She had accepted these conditions and used the 20 years to study Mao. She learned his rhetoric, his obsessions, his vulnerabilities, his methods of political attack. She absorbed, across 2 decades of proximity to the center of Chinese communist power, a specific understanding of how that power worked that her formal exclusion from it had paradoxically deepened rather than limited. By the time the Cultural Revolution created the opportunity for her political emergence, she was the best prepared revolutionary in China. The Cultural Revolution gave her everything she had been denied for 20 years. She became the cultural commissar of the revolution, the arbiter of what art, literature, film, and music were acceptable expressions of revolutionary consciousness. Her control over Chinese culture was total, in a way that has no equivalent in other political systems. Every novel, every film, every opera, every piece of music that Chinese people were permitted to see or hear passed through the filter of her approval. The 8 model operas that she developed and promoted were the only form of theatrical entertainment officially sanctioned in China during the peak of her influence. She was not governing culture, she was replacing it. Jiang Qing was the intellectual architect of the radical left position, the man who provided the theoretical framework within which the Cultural Revolution's excesses were justified and organized. Born in 1917 in Shandong, he had been a journalist and propagandist before becoming a senior official in Shanghai's party apparatus. His specific contribution to the Gang of Four's ideological project was the elaboration of a theory of continuous revolution that argued against the pragmatists who wanted to focus on economic development, that class struggle must be permanent, that the bourgeoisie could regenerate itself within socialist institutions, and that ideological purity required constant vigilance and constant struggle against the enemies within. This theoretical framework was not merely academic. It was the ideological weapon that the Gang of Four deployed against anyone who advocated for the practical economic reforms that the disasters of the Cultural Revolution had made urgently necessary. Anyone who suggested that China needed trained engineers, that agriculture needed material incentives, that the economy required planning mechanisms that went beyond revolutionary enthusiasm was, in Jiang's framework, a revisionist capitalist roader whose position within the party was itself evidence of the bourgeois corruption that permanent revolution needed to purge. Yao Wenyuan was the propagandist. Born in 1931 in Zhejiang, he had made his name as a literary critic before the Cultural Revolution, producing ideologically charged attacks on writers and intellectuals that served the party's internal political battles. His most famous pre-Cultural Revolution essay had been an attack on a play by Wu Han that Mao used as the opening shot of the Cultural Revolution. Yao controlled the Chinese press during the Cultural Revolution years with an absoluteness that made Soviet-style censorship look relatively benign by comparison. What appeared in print in China during those years appeared because Yao permitted it, and what did not appear because Yao forbade it. His control of information was the Gang of Four's most powerful operational instrument, a political faction that controls what people know, controls what they can think, and a faction that controls what people can think, controls, with some important qualifications, what they can do. Yao's management of the information environment was the mechanism through which the Gang of Four's political dominance was maintained, and through which potential opposition was detected and suppressed before it could organize. And then there was Wang Hongwen, the youngest, the most apparently authentic, the most personally tragic of the four. Wang had been born in 1935 in Changchun, in Jilin province, into a genuinely working-class family, unlike the other three, whose biographies were the biographies of educated revolutionaries who had made their way through the party's intellectual apparatus. Wang was what the Cultural Revolution's ideology claimed to be promoting, a worker who had risen on the basis of revolutionary commitment, rather than educational credentials. He had worked in a cotton textile factory in Shanghai after military service, and during the Cultural Revolution he had become the leader of the rebel faction in Shanghai, organizing and leading the mass movements that the Cultural Revolution's early phase encouraged. He was dynamic, physically impressive, possessed of the natural authority of someone who had led actual mass movements in actual situations of genuine danger. He was also, by most accounts, genuinely committed to the revolutionary vision that Mao's Cultural Revolution claimed to be advancing. Mao saw in Wang something he could not find elsewhere in the aging party leadership: youth, proletarian authenticity, and total loyalty. In 1973, he elevated Wang to the position of vice chairman of the party, making him the third-ranking figure in China at the age of 38. The promotion was extraordinary by any measure. A factory worker in his 30s with no higher education, no significant administrative experience beyond his Shanghai base, elevated above generals and veteran party officials to the position from which he was expected to eventually lead China. The elevation was also Wang's fatal mistake, though it would take several years for the fatal character of the mistake to become clear. Because Mao did not simply elevate Wang, he designated him as a potential successor. And in the Chinese Communist Party's political culture, in a system built on the absolute authority of the chairman, the designation of a potential successor was not a gift. It was the beginning of a process that had destroyed everyone who had previously occupied that position. The specific mechanisms by which the Gang of Four maintained and exercised their power during the years between the Cultural Revolution's launch and Mao's death are essential for understanding how completely those mechanisms depended on Mao's continued existence. The Gang of Four's power had three foundations. The first was Mao's protection, the specific shield that the chairman's continued endorsement provided against the attacks of their enemies within the party. The second was their control of the propaganda apparatus, which gave them the ability to shape the information environment within which political battles were conducted and to deploy the specific weapons of public denunciation and ideological accusation that had been the Cultural Revolution's primary instruments. The third was their control of the urban militias, particularly in Shanghai, which gave them a coercive capacity that was at least nominally independent of the People's Liberation Army's command structure. All three of these foundations were, in different ways, severely weakened by Mao's death. The protection disappeared instantaneously. Mao's endorsement was the source of the Gang of Four's legitimacy within the party. Without it, their specific authority derived not from their positions in the party hierarchy, which other people also occupied, but from the specific claim to be the authentic interpreters and guardians of Mao's revolutionary legacy. This claim was contestable in ways that the protection of a living Mao was not. The propaganda apparatus was powerful, but not omnipotent. It could shape what was published. It could suppress specific kinds of criticism and amplify specific kinds of praise. But it could not prevent the political calculations of the people who had the institutional authority to act, and those calculations were being made in the weeks after Mao's death in ways that the propaganda apparatus could not fully observe or control. The urban militias were significant, but were facing a military that did not respect them as a legitimate force, and whose command structure included people whose hostility to the Gang of Four was real and increasingly operational. A confrontation between the militias and the PLA would not be a confrontation between equals, and the Gang of Four's strategists understood this, which meant the militias were more useful as a threat than as an actually deployable force. The death of Mao exposed the specific hollowness at the center of the Gang of Four's power. It had always been derivative power, power that derived from Mao's authority rather than from any independent institutional base. When the source of the derivation died, what remained was the machinery without the engine. Hua Guofeng was, in the weeks immediately following Mao's death, the person the Gang of Four had most comprehensively underestimated. He was, by any objective measure, an improbable hero of the story of how the Gang of Four was destroyed. He was a provincial party official, a man of Mao's generation but not of Mao's inner circle, who had been elevated to the position of premier in the final period of Mao's life through a combination of political reliability and the specific quality that had made him attractive to a dying leader looking for someone safe. He had no independent political base of his own that might make him dangerous. Mao had left him a note, reportedly written in the chairman's shaking hand, that said, "With you in charge, I am at ease." Those 6 words were the entirety of Hua Guofeng's claim to legitimate authority after Mao's death. They were also, as it turned out, sufficient. The Gang of Four's assessment of Hua was contemptuous. They saw him as a placeholder, a bureaucratic figure who would be manageable in the way that Hua Guofeng's previous career had suggested. A man of limited vision who would be content with formal authority while the Gang of Four exercised real power. They believed they could dominate him without confronting him, that the combination of their propaganda control and their party network would be sufficient to marginalize anyone who opposed them. They were wrong about this in the most consequential way possible. Hua understood his own position with a clarity that the Gang of Four's contempt for him had prevented them from perceiving. He understood that his authority was fragile, that it depended on the specific claim of Mao's endorsement, and that the Gang of Four's challenge to that authority was not something that could be resolved through negotiation or compromise. It was a zero-sum contest in which one side would destroy the other, and the only question was which side would move first and most decisively. He also understood something about the Gang of Four that their own assessment of their position had obscured. They were isolated. Their decade of radical politics had created a vast and diverse pool of enemies within the party leadership, the military, and the state apparatus. The people they had persecuted, humiliated, imprisoned, and driven to suicide during the Cultural Revolution were still alive, still influential, still remembering, and those people were now calculating in the specific way that people calculate when a political environment changes with the death of the person who has been protecting their enemies. What the new situation made possible. The conspiracy that produced the October 6th arrests was not organized by one person or through one channel. It was the convergence of multiple sets of interests, multiple personal histories of grievance and calculation, and multiple institutional actors who arrived at the same conclusion through different routes. Hua Guofeng was the political center of the operation. Jiang Qing, the 80-year-old marshal, who had spent the Cultural Revolution in political eclipse and who had watched close associates tortured and killed by the apparatus the Gang of Four controlled, was the military dimension. Wang Dongqing, the head of the Central Guards Bureau who controlled the security arrangements for the party leadership compound at Zhongnanhai, was the operational instrument. The military's role in the planning and execution of the operation was essential, but it was not the kind of military role that produces tanks in the streets and dramatic confrontations. It was the quieter military role of providing the specific personnel and the specific command authority that made the arrests operationally possible, while the civilian political framework provided the legitimacy that prevented the operation from being characterized as a simple military coup. The specific timing of October 6th was determined by a convergence of factors that the conspirators were monitoring with the specific anxiety of people who understood that the window for action was finite. There were reports that the Gang of Four was planning to move first, to use the memorial events surrounding Mao's death to consolidate their position and eliminate the threats they perceived. Yao Wenyuan was controlling the press. Jiang Qing was attempting to position herself as Mao's political heir. Zhang Chunqiao was working the party network. Wang Hongwen was managing the militia structures in Shanghai. The conspirators concluded that waiting was more dangerous than acting. The plan was simple in its essentials and carefully designed in its execution. Each member of the Gang of Four would be summoned to a separate location by a pretext that would not immediately reveal the nature of what was happening. The summoning and the arrest would be coordinated so that none of the four would be able to warn the others or mobilize any resistance before all four were secured. The guards who normally provided their personal security would be replaced by personnel loyal to Wang Dongqing, and the entire operation would be completed within a time window so narrow that the urban militias in Shanghai, the Gang of Four's primary potential source of armed support, would not have time to organize before the facts on the ground were established. October 6th, 1976, the 27th day after Mao's death. The operation began in the late afternoon and was complete by midnight. Wang Hongwen, as we began, walked into Reading Room 119, believing he was attending a meeting about the publication of Mao's works. The room he entered contained not the colleagues he expected, but the personal guards of Hua Guofeng, men whose loyalty was to the operation rather than to him. The accounts that have emerged from participants and witnesses describe Wang's initial reaction as one of confused disbelief, the specific expression of a man who has encountered a reality so inconsistent with his model of the world that his mind requires additional information before it can process what is happening. He attempted to resist, physically, briefly, in the way of someone whose instincts are those of a militia leader who has spent years in situations of physical confrontation. He was subdued quickly and completely by the guards who outnumbered him and who had the authority and the preparation that he lacked. He was handcuffed and removed from the room that he had entered as one of China's most powerful men and from which he departed as a prisoner. Jiang Qing, who had been summoned to what he had been told was the same meeting, arrived in a different room where a similar reception awaited. Jiang's reaction, by the accounts of those present, was calmer than Wang's, in the specific way of someone whose analytical intelligence has immediately processed the situation and recognized that the game has concluded. He offered no physical resistance. He was removed with the cold efficiency that his own cold temperament had always used to manage the elimination of others. Yao Wenyuan was at the Central Broadcasting Office, the institutional center of his power over the Chinese information environment. He was the most isolated of the four at the moment of the arrests, surrounded by personnel whose loyalty was to the institution rather than to him personally, in a location where the specific coercive resources that might have provided some protection were absent. His arrest was the simplest of the four. Jiang Qing presented the most complicated operational challenge, not because she had the most resources available to resist, but because her status as the widow of Mao Zedong created a specific political complication that the operation's designers had needed to think through carefully. Arresting the chairman's widow carried symbolic implications that arresting the others did not, and the manner of her arrest needed to communicate that this was not an attack on Mao's legacy, but a protection of it. She was confronted in her residence within Zhongnanhai by officials who informed her, with the specific political formulation that the operation had prepared for this purpose, that she was being investigated for crimes against the state. Her reaction was, by multiple accounts, one of outraged disbelief, combined with the specific invocation of Mao's name as a shield that she had used throughout her political career. She attempted to claim that what was happening to her was an attack on the chairman himself. The officials present had been briefed for exactly this response and had the specific counter-argument prepared. They were acting in defense of Mao's legacy against the people who had betrayed it. She was removed from her residence and taken into custody. By midnight on October 6th, 27 days after Mao's death, all four members of the Gang of Four were under arrest. In Shanghai, the urban militias that had been the Gang of Four's most significant coercive asset did not mobilize. The speed of the arrests, combined with the specific management of communications that prevented news of what had happened from reaching Shanghai in a form and at a time that would have allowed organized response, meant that the window for militia action closed before the militia commanders understood it had opened. By the time Shanghai received confirmation of what had happened, the military assets that could have suppressed any militia response were already in position, and the political calculation that the militia commanders were required to make in the specific environment of the new reality was the same calculation that political actors always make when the correlation of forces has changed decisively. Accommodation was safer than resistance. The militias stood down. The 27 days between Mao's death and the arrests of October 6th were not 27 days of obvious political crisis. From the outside, and even from many positions inside the Chinese political system, the period looked like a managed transition, a unified leadership grieving the chairman, making appropriate arrangements for his succession, navigating the complex emotional and political terrain of the post-Mao period in ways that maintained stability. This apparent stability was the surface of something much more volatile, a period of intense factional calculation that was conducted in the specific way that high-stakes political maneuvering in systems without formal mechanisms for conflict resolution is always conducted. Through private conversations, indirect signals, the assessment of whose position was strengthening and whose was weakening, and the progressive crystallization of the specific coalition that would eventually move, and the specific moment at which it would move. The 27 days had several distinct phases. The first phase, roughly the first week after Mao's death, was the phase of mourning and the management of the immediate succession. This was the period in which the formal questions of who held which positions were being worked through the party apparatus, during which the public face of the transition was the collective leadership of the party grieving the chairman. The Gang of Four used this period to position themselves as the authentic interpreters of Mao's legacy, Jiang Qing most visibly, while attempting to manage the formal succession arrangements in ways favorable to their interests. The second phase was the period of covert coalition building, in which Hua Guofeng and the people around him were assessing the specific personnel question of who could be trusted, who had the institutional authority and the personal willingness to participate in the operation being contemplated, and how the operation should be structured to minimize the risk of exposure before it could be executed. This phase required the kind of careful, personal communication that left the minimum possible trace, conducted through meetings and conversations whose innocuous surface concealed the specific content of what was being discussed. The third phase was the operational planning phase, in which the specific details of the October 6th operation were worked out. The timing, the locations, the personnel, the communication protocols, the contingency plans. This phase required the specific operational expertise of people like Wang Dongqing, whose institutional role gave them the practical knowledge of how security operations within Zhongnanhai were conducted, and whose control of the guard apparatus gave them the human resources the operation required. The fourth phase was the final days before October 6th, when the information reaching the conspirators suggested that the Gang of Four was becoming aware that something was being planned against them and was preparing to move preemptively. This phase was the most dangerous of the 27 days. The window was closing, the risk of exposure was increasing, and the calculation about when to act was being made against a clock that the conspirators could feel accelerating. The decision to move on October 6th was ultimately a decision made under the specific pressure of that clock. Act now before the Gang of Four acts, or lose the initiative and potentially the operation. They acted. The aftermath of the October 6th arrests was the beginning of one of the most comprehensive exercises in political narrative management in the history of the People's Republic of China. The immediate challenge facing Hua Guofeng and the people around him was the communication of what had happened to the party membership, the military, the population of China, and the international community in ways that established the legitimacy of the arrests and prevented any organized response in support of the Gang of Four. The specific narrative that was constructed in the days and weeks following October 6th was a narrative that has shaped the historical understanding of the Gang of Four ever since, and that requires examination not because it is entirely false, but because it is specifically constructed for political purposes and therefore omits and emphasizes in ways that serve those purposes rather than historical accuracy. The narrative positioned Hua Guofeng's action as the fulfillment of Mao's own wishes, the specific invocation of the note that said, "With you in charge, I am at ease," serving as the textual evidence that Mao had designated Hua as his true political heir, and that the Gang of Four's attempt to claim that designation was a betrayal of Mao's actual intentions. The Gang of Four were therefore not simply political rivals who had been defeated in a succession contest. They were traitors who had attempted to steal Mao's legacy for their own purposes. This framing served multiple purposes simultaneously. It protected Mao's legacy from the criticism that a straightforward assessment of the Cultural Revolution's disasters would have required. By assigning responsibility for those disasters to the Gang of Four rather than to Mao himself, it legitimized Hua's authority as the true executor of Mao's wishes, and it provided a framework within which the gradual abandonment of the Cultural Revolution's specific policies could be presented not as the rejection of Mao's vision, but as the correction of the Gang of Four's betrayal of that vision. The political trials of 1980 and 1981, in which the Gang of Four were prosecuted before a special tribunal, were the final act of the narrative's institutionalization. The trials were the most public element of what had been a process conducted entirely behind closed doors, this specific theatrical event that made the narrative of the Gang of Four's crimes available to the Chinese population and to the world in a form that carried the authority of judicial determination. The trials were not, by Western legal standards, fair trials. The defendants were not given adequate access to counsel of their own choosing. The charges were framed in ways that reflected political requirements rather than strict legal categories. The evidence was curated to support the specific narrative that the prosecution required. The outcome was determined before the proceedings began, but the trials were not simply show trials in the sense of pure fabrication. The specific crimes they documented, the persecution of specific individuals during the Cultural Revolution, the abuse of party authority for factional purposes, the use of the propaganda apparatus to advance specific political interests at the expense of the broader party membership, were real. The evidence of those crimes was genuine evidence of real events that had actually happened. The trial's political purpose was not to fabricate the charges, but to present genuine crimes within a narrative framework that assigned them exclusively to the Gang of Four and protected everyone else who had participated in or permitted them from the accountability that a genuinely comprehensive reckoning would have required. The specific fate of each member of the Gang of Four after October 6th illuminates different dimensions of what the arrests and trials accomplished. Jiang Qing was from the beginning the most politically complicated of the four. Her status as Mao's widow created a specific constraint on how she could be treated that did not apply to the others. Executing her or treating her in ways that were publicly visible as brutal risked creating the perception of an attack on Mao himself that no post-Mao leadership could afford. She was held in Beijing's Qincheng prison, the maximum security facility that had housed disgraced senior officials throughout the People's Republic's history. The conditions of her detention were those of someone whose status required specific treatment that ordinary prisoners did not receive: adequate food, medical care, the specific amenities that her position as the chairman's widow demanded even in disgrace. The psychological dimensions of her detention were perhaps more significant than the physical ones. She had spent her entire adult political career wielding the power of public denunciation, of the organized mass criticism that had destroyed thousands of people during the Cultural Revolution. In detention, she was required to submit to the interrogation process that the security apparatus used to construct the confessions and the evidentiary record that the trials required. Her resistance to this process was the most sustained and the most visible of the four. She refused to acknowledge the court's authority. She defended her actions as loyal implementation of Mao's instructions. In the most dramatic moment of the trial, she screamed her defiance at the judges. Making revolution is no crime. Rebellion is justified. And I was Mao's dog. Whoever he told me to bite, I bit. The second statement was more honest than the first. It captured, in the specific admission it contained, the precise nature of the position she had occupied, not the independent revolutionary force that the Gang of Four's own propaganda had sometimes presented her as, but the instrument of someone else's will who had used that instrument with a ferocity that exceeded what the will itself sometimes required. She received a suspended death sentence, which in the Chinese legal system of the period was effectively a sentence of life imprisonment subject to review. She was later reported to have developed cancer. She was released from prison in 1991 on medical grounds. She hanged herself on May 14, 1991, in the bathroom of a Shanghai hospital where she was receiving treatment. She was 77 years old. She left a note. It said, according to the accounts that emerged from Chinese sources, "Chairman Mao, your student and fighter comes to see you. Whatever assessment one makes of Jiang Qing, the note reveals something that the political mythology around her consistently obscures. She had genuinely believed. The ideology that she had used so cynically as a political instrument had also been, in some real sense, her own belief. The violence she had directed at others had been, in her own understanding, the service of a cause that she considered worth the violence." Jiang Qing was also sentenced to suspended death, later commuted to life imprisonment. He maintained an almost complete silence throughout the trial, and the subsequent period of his imprisonment, refusing to engage with the proceedings in any substantive way, neither defending himself as Jiang Qing had done, nor cooperating as Yao Wenyuan partially did. He died in prison in 2005 at the age of 87. Yao Wenyuan received a 20-year sentence and was released in 1996. He subsequently lived in Shanghai in conditions of careful anonymity, reportedly publishing occasional writing under pseudonyms, and died in 2005 at the age of 74. Wang Hongwen received a life sentence. The account of his time in prison is the most psychologically stark of the four. He was subjected to interrogation processes that exploited the specific vulnerabilities of his political identity. The interrogators consistently challenged the narrative of proletarian authenticity that had been the foundation of his political legitimacy, confronting him with evidence of the privileged lifestyle he had adopted after his elevation to power, the evidence of hypocrisy that contradicted the ideological positioning of his public persona. He confessed more completely than any of the other three. His confession acknowledged guilt in terms that the prosecutors had specifically sought, providing the evidentiary record that the trial required and demonstrating in the specific act of confession the collapse of the defiance that might have given his political identity some residual coherence. He died in prison on August 3, 1992, at the age of 57. The cause was stated to be liver disease. The announcement was brief, clinical, and carried no sense of significance. A few sentences from the Xinhua news agency describing the death of a counter-revolutionary who had paid the appropriate price for his crimes. The most fascinating life, the life of the worker who had risen to become the potential heir of the chairman of the People's Republic, ended in a prison cell, barely noticed by the country that had once put his face on its propaganda posters. The most important legacy of the 27 days is not the fate of the 4 people who were arrested. It is what the arrests made possible. The removal of the Gang of Four cleared the specific political space that allowed Deng Xiaoping's rehabilitation and eventual dominance. Deng had been purged for the second time in April 1976, blamed for the Tiananmen incident in which crowds had gathered to mourn Zhou Enlai in ways that the Gang of Four characterized as counter-revolutionary. His rehabilitation was not immediate after October 6th, but the political environment that the arrests created made it inevitable. Within 3 years of the October 6th arrests, Deng Xiaoping had consolidated his position as China's paramount leader and had launched the reform and opening policy that would transform China from the ideological battleground of the Cultural Revolution into the world's most dynamic emerging economy. The GDP growth that followed, the hundreds of millions of people lifted from poverty, the extraordinary expansion of Chinese industrial and technological capacity, all of this has its proximate origin in the specific political clearing that the 27 days accomplished. This is the deepest irony of the Gang of Four's story. The people who had spent a decade fighting to prevent the rehabilitation of the pragmatists, who had defined their political identity around the permanent revolution and the rejection of economic development as a bourgeois betrayal of the revolutionary project, whose specific defeat was the necessary condition for the most successful program of economic development in human history. The cultural revolution that the Gang of Four had championed and extended was, by any measure of human welfare, that is not purely ideological, one of the most destructive episodes in Chinese history. The closure of universities for a decade, the destruction of a generation of professional and intellectual capacity, the deaths of hundreds of thousands or potentially millions of people directly attributable to the persecution of the Cultural Revolution period, the specific economic waste of years in which China's human capital was consumed in ideological struggle rather than directed at productive development. The 27 days ended that, not immediately, not without the transitional period that any political transformation of this scale requires, but the October 6th arrests were the specific event that closed the door on the Cultural Revolution era and opened the door to the era that followed. What does the story of the 27 days tell us about power and its succession in systems built around one man's authority? The first lesson is about the specific fragility of derivative power. The Gang of Four's power was entirely derivative. Every element of it derived from Mao, his protection, his endorsement of their positions, his willingness to use his authority to override the institutional structures and the political actors that opposed them. Without Mao, They had the formal positions that his authority had elevated them to, but they did not have the independent institutional base that could sustain those positions against a determined challenge. This is the specific vulnerability that any political actor in a system of absolute personal authority faces when that authority dies. The authority cannot be transferred because it derives from the specific person who holds it, not from the institutional positions that the person's authority has populated with its beneficiaries. The beneficiaries retain the positions. They do not retain the authority. The Gang of Four discovered this with a speed that their own assessment of their position had not prepared them for. 27 days was all it took. The second lesson is about the specific danger of the designated successor. Wang Hongwen's story is the specific illustration of the principle that has appeared repeatedly in this series. The person designated as the heir in a system of absolute personal authority is placed in the most dangerous position in the system. The designation creates the expectation of succession without the institutional mechanisms to implement it, creates enemies among everyone who is not designated while not providing the authority to deal with those enemies, and creates a dependency on the continued goodwill and continued life of the person who has made the designation. When Mao died, Wang Hongwen was the designated heir without the authority to succeed. He had the title that Mao's endorsement had given him. He did not have the 25 years of revolutionary credentials, the military relationships, the personal network of institutional loyalties that Mao had accumulated across decades. He was 38 years old, intelligent and energetic, but occupying a position that the system had created for him rather than one that he had built for himself. The man who is elevated rather than ascendant is the man who falls first when the person who elevated him is gone. The third lesson is about the specific mechanism by which succession crises in systems of absolute authority are resolved. There is no legitimate mechanism. The Constitution of the People's Republic of China in 1976 did not provide a procedure for determining who would lead China after Mao's death. The party's internal rules did not provide a procedure. The specific claim to authority that each of the contending factions was making in the 27 days after Mao's death was not a claim based on any institutional procedure. It was a claim based on the specific assertion that their faction was the authentic interpreter of Mao's wishes, the true heir to his revolutionary legacy, the legitimate continuation of his authority. In the absence of institutional procedure, the resolution of succession crises in systems of absolute authority is determined by the correlation of forces. Who has the military? Who has the security apparatus? Who has the key organizational positions? And who moves first and most decisively? Hua Guofeng and the people who organized October 6th had the key military and security relationships. They had Ye Jianying's military authority and Wang Dongqing's control of the guard apparatus. They moved first and most decisively. The Gang of Four had the propaganda apparatus and the Shanghai militias. Neither of these proved sufficient against the specific combination of military authority and operational decisiveness that the October 6th operation deployed. The lesson is not that the right side won, in any morally meaningful sense of rightness. It is that the side that had the military and the security apparatus and moved first won, which is how succession crises in systems of absolute authority have always been resolved and will always be resolved, because systems of absolute authority do not contain within them the institutional mechanisms that would make any other resolution possible. The night of October 6th, 1976, Reading Room 119, Zhongnanhai. Wang Hongwen crosses the threshold. The guards are waiting. The handcuffs go on. And in that moment, and in the three simultaneous moments in the three other locations across Zhongnanhai and the city, something that has been building for a decade collapses instantaneously, not with a bang, not with tanks in the street, not with the mass mobilizations that the Cultural Revolution had always used as its primary instrument. With 4 arrests in 4 rooms, coordinated by a small group of men who had understood, with the specific clarity of people whose survival depended on understanding it correctly, that the only way to end an era was to end it completely and to end it first. 27 days after the death of the man who had made them powerful, the heirs of Mao Zedong were prisoners. The Cultural Revolution was over. The China that the world would know for the next half-century was beginning, and the specific mechanism by which it began was the arrest of 4 people in 4 rooms in a single night, planned by men who understood that in a system built around one man's authority, the death of that man creates not a transition, but a crisis, and the only resolution of the crisis is the one that happens before anyone else's resolution can be organized. The 27 days were not simply the end of the Gang of 4. They were the proof of the proposition that systems built on absolute personal authority always face and always fail to resolve through legitimate institutional means the question of what happens when the absolute authority dies. The answer, in China in 1976, as in Rome and Byzantium and every other system that has tried to concentrate all authority in one person, was the same. The guards are waiting, the handcuffs go on, and a new era begins.